Yes, a return to Italy as well. Once again, 2 on the calendar, 1 in Monza as well on the way. Now, I know it is early on in the season, and we'll be saying this until, I don't know, when we get to maybe Silverstone, then we can start to say, actually, no, is it the time to then start to focus on next year? When do Mercedes cut their losses and focus on next year's car?
That's a bit of a frightener. Yeah.
Who's brave enough to take that?
Well, it's early doors this year, isn't it? It's early doors this year, and you're looking at evolution, not revolution. So they're going to have to get there. They're going to have to get their head around it and understand these regulation sets.
I think you're right. I think the next 2 or 3 races could be crucial to that, actually, and to that whole decision, don't you? Because, you know, by the time we get to Miami, I know it's a new track, so that's tricky in a way, but there has been time to develop stuff and put things on the car. I think it was always going to be a bit of a problem for Imola because they didn't have much free practice time.
Well, I mean, here's one for you. What happens if George is still in it? And Lewis and they managed to build, build a car and build a performance. And do they then throw their chips behind George?
That's a good question too.
That would be an interesting, very, very interesting interplay at Mercedes. That would.
Certainly the young apprentice and the old hand now, Lewis Hamilton, that dynamic could well evolve. Certainly one to think about. Tell you what has changed dramatically since last time we were out. Aston Martin. Where were they in Australia? Now, back in the points, and they had 0, no points. Sebastian Vettel in particular putting in an excellent drive. Lance Stroll, always seems to go well in these mixed conditions too. You look back to, when was it, Turkey a couple of years ago, and sticking it on pole position in the changeable track conditions. But good to see Aston Martin back on form, Ben, also, but encouraging signs that Vettel, perhaps this was the bit of motivation he needs to go. He can still race up there. There's still work to be done.
Yeah, it was encouraging. But I do think, as you say, the changeable conditions are what helped Aston a bit this weekend, because that suited them. They responded well. They were one of the early pit stoppers as well with Vettel. Ricciardo, of course, was the first to come into slicks, but I noticed that Vettel was very soon in as well. So, yeah, I think they played it well with the changeable conditions there, no doubt about it. And whether they're going to actually have the pace when we get to places like Miami again, to places where we've got very consistent weather conditions, I'm not too sure. Obviously, they're waiting for some upgrades and developments as well, but they needed that boost. I'd spoke to one of the guys from the team after Australia who said that those 3 days were the worst 3 days he'd ever experienced in Formula One. So at least they had a lift this time.
I think there might have been a weather forecaster making a rather swift exit from the F1 paddock, actually, because the whole field were pretty tardy onto the slicks based around a sort of notional 10-minute rain shower that never quite arrived in the mid-race. And there was a moment where I do yell at my TV occasionally, so it's which I don't know whether I should admit, because I never know if anybody who's hiring me to commentate might be watching, so just let them know I do it for free. But I was yelling Box K-Mag, because he was really struggling on his. I know him a little bit from the sports car days, and he was struggling on his set of inters. And the whole field, those, as you correctly say, Ben, those who jumped early really did make a benefit in getting those tyres fired up.
So, well, let's actually look at that sort of midfield pack as well, because once again, strong showings from K-Mag, from Valtteri Bottas as well, really hounding George Russell in the final stages. Couldn't quite find a way through, though, in the end. And also Yuki Tsunoda, Ben, doing a great job for AlphaTauri as well. And, he's been a bit underrated so far this year. He's got a couple of points on the board. He's ahead of Gasly in the standings too. So, and was having a great battle towards the end, making his way through the pack. So nice to see a strong midfield battle from those guys.
It was actually, yeah, very encouraging. And in fact, Valtteri was a bit unlucky because he had a slow pit stop as well, didn't he? So without that slow pit stop, I think George would have been under even more trouble than he was. And George did well to fend him off at the end there. So fair play to him. And as you say, I was pleased to see Yuki Tsunoda. I'm impressed with some of the stuff that he's done this year. Last year, we know he started strongly, then went through a bit of a dip. There were a few mistakes, and there was that crash at Imola in qualifying last year. This time, he's putting it together well, and when I've watched him racing as well, there's good racecraft there. There's good. He knows when there are cars around him. There was a part in the race yesterday where. Who was it? It was trying to get alongside him, and he was very aware. I thought his race awareness was actually very, very good. Yeah,
he's worked on it, hasn't he, Yuki? He's still full beans in the cockpit. I mean, the radio message when he made the pass late in the race, "Let's go!" It's something I absolutely love about him, and I think I want to see him succeed. I don't know. I find myself watching him, really wanting to see him succeed because. He's a human in the car. You can tell that, as opposed to some other drivers who just come across, and it's no detriment to their character. In fact, it's probably beneficial in the circumstances that they come across as a machine. Yuki definitely doesn't. It's something I really like about him. But yeah, the incidents are fading out, aren't they? And they're believing in him, and the performances are coming back in, and it really does show. I mean, There were stages through the middle of last year when he'd have an accident. Gasly, performing at the front of the field, podiums, delivery, and Yuki was nowhere to be seen in having incidents that people questioned whether he should still be there. And they've really believed in him. They've kept him through this year, and I really hope he can deliver on that because I would like to see that program move in that direction. Of nurturing rather than just throw him in, nope, throw him in, nope, etc.
Which, of course, is what Red Bull has had a bit of a reputation for, hasn't it? And you're right. I think everybody wants Yuki to do well, don't they? Because he is this character in that cockpit. And, Red Bull decided to move him to Faenza nearer the AlphaTauri HQ so he could be around there, be in the simulator more, have a more rigid regime, training every morning. And if you've watched the Netflix Drive to Survive series, you'll know how much Yuki Tsunoda hates exercising, so he's a character that we can all absolutely relate to as well. It's brilliant seeing a professional athlete really not want to go for a jog in the morning, unlike Brundle in the gym every day.
Got back.
Straight back there. But a brilliant fight as ever as well from Bottas and Magnussen. Now, a topic that came up and has been, constantly talked about actually since it was introduced, wasn't it, back in 2010? DRS, particularly strong in some races, not so strong in others, was quite strong here in Imola, Ben, and a bit of a weird one though, because obviously we started under wet conditions and it moved to dry. Took a while for race control to activate DRS, so we were sort of stuck in a bit of a traffic jam, and if moves were going to be made, they had to be made, the old-fashioned way, with an actual pass using toe around the sides. Do you think DRS should have been brought in a bit earlier during the race? How are you seeing the DRS this year? Is it too powerful?
I would have liked to have seen it coming a bit earlier. It felt to me that they went a little bit deep, and maybe it is because of the Bottas-Russell shunt from last year. I don't know, but it did feel to me that there was time that the DRS could have opened up earlier. Mind you, when we did that, there weren't as many overtakes even on DRS as I was thinking there would be, and that was interesting. Again, the Albon able to fend off Gasly and Hamilton unable to get past Gasly, and I know Gasly had DRS from behind Albon, but that was quite interesting, and so it just goes to show that it's not always that straightforward. But we do know that Imola historically has been one of the hardest tracks on which to overtake. It's never been a circuit where you see phenomenal amounts of overtaking, unless perhaps you've got a damp track, then yes, a bit more. But in the dry, it's always been a bit of a follow my leader track. And I was still encouraged by the fact that they can follow a bit more closely through those last couple of corners, so that when DRS comes into operation, and we certainly saw that more in the sprint race, then you can make an effective move. So for me, DRS works. It is still an important part of motorsport, of Formula One anyway. And I did feel it could have come in a little bit earlier. I think Michael Massey would have put it in earlier last year, but it's a slightly different regime now.
What we also had is a reasonable sized tailwind actually down the front straight, which really it's incredibly scientific to set up DRS. Drag, of course, squaring with speed. So the drag reduction is a coefficient based around the headwind, the speed, and then the growth of that speed in comparison to the car in front, which of course doesn't have the flap open, to the terminal speed. So to actually set that up, if we raced in Imola today with, let's say, the wind going in the other direction at the same velocity, it would have been a different race. And so to take a moment in time, a day, a snapshot, even an hour, and say, on the basis of that, DRS is a defunct concept, is not really fair on the concept itself. I don't think you can put much more of a long DRS zone there. They were just struggling to get on the throttle out of the second Ravazza, which was a bit of a weird one. And I think we maybe found the limitation of what you can realistically do with a new regulation set to make these cars follow each other closely. They're still making some downforce. Yeah, there must be disturbing the air. And it's, as Ben says, it's just, there have to be tracks that are hard to overtake on for there to be tracks that are easy to overtake on. And this is just on one end of the spectrum.
Here's one for you, though, and this came from Gary Paffett, the long-time former McLaren tester, saying that, I think he said this on Twitter, because people were saying, what are the alternatives to DRS? And maybe a situation which I think was back in GP3, maybe the 2016 time, and was also used, he said, in DTM, where they had a limited amount of times they could actually use DRS in a similar way to, back in the day where they had KERS. They only had so much they could use before it, reset again. But is that something maybe that could be implemented just to throw a little bit of strategy into it?
I don't know. I'm not sure. What do you feel, Alex? For me, you then have to be on top of who's used what and when, and it almost gets more complicated for me as trying to put that across, I think.
Essentially, Formula One cars do have push to pass. Most of them. It's just buried in the intricacies of their energy systems, and they're all different. I do wish sometimes we could communicate that better, or we had some way to see that. As something I talked to the guys back at F1 HQ about a lot, because I think, for example, Lando Norris, and indeed most of the young generation of drivers, Verstappen and Charles Leclerc, you see them, for example, let's take Imola, stacking up all of their energy around the lap to then defend down to the DRS detection point or out of the DRS detection point to give them the best opportunity to defend their position. That energy status is going on all the time. So give them push to pass is great, is a great question. The answer to that question is they've already got push to pass, and it's also incredibly more complex and interesting than that. We just need to communicate that to our audience that are watching the race lap on lap.
Yeah, that's a very good point, isn't it? Because within all of the ERS and the technical terms is essentially, you're right, a push to pass. They decide where they want to use it around the track, where works best for them. There's always a lot to talk about. It has been, an exciting and entertaining Formula One season so far. Charles Leclerc is still leading the standings, but now by just 27 points, I believe, from Max Verstappen, who is second with 59. Then it's Sergio Perez, George Russell, and Carlos Sainz after two non-scores. Still just hanging on to the fringes of the top five. Lewis Hamilton down in 7th at the moment. So still a long season ahead of us. Before we wrap things up here, gents, your one big takeaway from Imola that you noticed, that you enjoyed, that you'd like to see next time out, perhaps in Miami?
Okay, that's a tricky one, isn't it? The big take, I think the big takeaway is let's not have too many Ferrari errors. We need some proper racing. We need to see Ferrari delivering what we know they can deliver and have delivered, but we need to see a team combination, and it hasn't quite worked for Sainz and Leclerc to deliver the 1-2s. The season started strongly for them, but too many mistakes this last weekend. So see if they can clarify that.
I totally agree. I think we need a performance from Ferrari, but I think actually on the engineering side, Ferrari need to deliver a race car. They've delivered a qualifying car. They've got a car which is fast enough to compete at the front of the field, but Red Bull can put a slippery machine out on track that actually is so tricky to overtake that you have to make the big lunges and the big moves. And if there's one person I don't want to make a big move on, it's Max Verstappen, because he's just plain not going to let me. Ferrari need a strategy, a think outside the box strategy, whether it's competing on tyre degradation, which they don't appear to do, competing in the high-speed corners, competing in the pit stops. They've got to find a way to beat them, to beat Red Bull over the race distance and make Red Bull react. And that is, I think, what's going to keep the momentum in this championship and keep it alive.
Well, you make it sound exciting, and it is exciting, and not long to wait. Although we get a little weekend off, and then we head to Miami. But in the meantime, make sure you are tuned in across Crash.net for all the latest news and analysis across the week. And then we shall be back with you next week to preview all things Miami as F1 heads there for the first time ever. Get your questions in, leave them in the comments section, or tweet, Instagram, or Facebook us. Just search Crash F1. Please do leave us a review wherever you get your podcast, and we shall see you here next week. But in the meantime, from myself, Harry Benjamin, from Ben Edwards, and from Alex Brundle, bye-bye.